The lockdown announcement. I was halfway through the afternoon shift when the first announcement came through the internal system, calm enough to sound routine, but just off in a way that made people pause. It instructed all ground staff to hold positions and await further directives. No explanation, no urgency, just controlled language that usually meant something had already gone wrong. I didn't move at first. Neither did anyone else around me. The terminal was still loud, full of rolling luggage, boarding calls, and a constant hum of people moving without thinking. But the rhythm had changed. It was subtle, the way conversation stalled half a second too long, the way eyes lifted toward the ceiling speakers instead of ignoring them. That hesitation spread faster than any official instruction. The second announcement came less than a minute later, and this time the tone shifted. All outbound flights were suspended immediately. Gates were to remain closed. Security personnel were instructed to initiate full lockdown procedures. That word landed hard. Lockdown wasn't used unless someone had already decided the situation couldn't be contained. Movement changed instantly. People who had been waiting started standing. People who had been standing started moving. The logic of the space broke down. Lines dissolved. Gate agents stopped scanning tickets. A man near me asked a question no one answered, then asked it louder, as if volume could force clarity out of a system that no longer had any. I stepped back from the desk and watched instead of reacting. That was the first decision that mattered. Most people try to solve chaos by moving faster. That only makes them part of it. From where I stood, I could see the exits being sealed, metal shutters dropping over access points that were never meant to close all at once. Security teams moved with purpose, but even they were out of sync, overlapping, repeating motions, following protocol instead of adapting to what was actually happening. Then I noticed the screens. Flight boards weren't just delaying, they were freezing. Information stopped updating in real time. The system was lagging behind events, which meant decisions were being made on data that was already outdated. That gap was dangerous. It meant anyone relying on instructions would always be one step behind the reality unfolding around them. A third announcement tried to restore order, directing passengers to remain calm and stay in designated areas. But by then, calm was gone. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers, and I could see it stacking in real time. Small movements turning into rushed decisions turning into collisions, voices rising, directions ignored, authority dissolving in front of me. That was when I understood the problem. This wasn't a situation the airport was designed to handle. Every system in place assumed people would follow instructions. But instructions require trust, and trust had already started breaking down. Once that happens, the system doesn't fail all at once. It collapses unevenly, creating gaps where nothing works the way it should. I stopped looking at the crowd and started looking at patterns. Where movement slowed, where it accelerated, which exits drew pressure, which areas stayed strangely clear. Those details mattered more than whatever the next announcement would say. Because whatever this was, it was moving faster than the system meant to control it. And the only way to stay ahead of it was to stop following instructions and start thinking like the system had already failed. By the time security sealed the final exit, the airport wasn't a controlled environment anymore. It was a closed system under stress, and everyone inside it was reacting instead of adapting. I knew then that staying where I was meant waiting for instructions that wouldn't come in time. So I stepped away from my station, already calculating where the real control points were and how long it would take before someone else realized they didn't exist anymore. I didn't feel panic, just a narrowing focus that made everything else irrelevant. The announcements kept playing, but they were background noise now, echoes of a system still pretending it was in control of something it had already lost completely. Control, tower access. I moved before the next announcement finished. Waiting for clarity was no longer useful. The system was lagging, and anything it told us now would already be outdated by the time it reached the floor. What still mattered were access points, and I had one most people didn't. The control tower wasn't meant for general staff, but my clearance covered enough of the operational side to get me through the first layer of restrictions. The stairwell entrance was already locked down, keypad flashing red, cycling through denied access messages for anyone without authorization. I didn't hesitate. I keyed in my code, held it a fraction longer than usual, and the system paused before granting entry. That delay told me everything. Even secured systems were starting to lag. Inside, the noise dropped instantly. The thick doors sealed behind me, cutting off the rising chaos from the terminal below. It didn't eliminate it completely, but it reduced it to something distant, manageable. For the first time since the announcement started, I could think without interruption. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. Elevators rely on stable power and stable systems, and neither of those could be assumed anymore. The climb was steady, controlled, each level quieter than the last. The higher I went, the more the urgency below felt disconnected from where I was heading. That separation wasn't just physical. It was perspective. By the time I reached the top, the difference was absolute. The control tower was still operational, at least on the surface. Screens were active, radars still cycling, communication channels open but overloaded. A few controllers remained at their stations, voices tight, repeating instructions that were either ignored or impossible to follow. Their focus was still on aircraft, on maintaining order in the sky, even as everything on the ground was coming apart. I didn't interrupt them. Their system hadn't caught up yet. Mine had to. I stepped toward the glass and looked down. From above, the airport stopped being a collection of people and became a system under pressure. Movement patterns were clear in a way they hadn't been on ground. Dense clusters formed near sealed exits, compressing into bottlenecks that had nowhere to release. Open spaces existed too, but they were temporary, shifting as people moved without coordination. The runways told a different story. Several aircraft sat idle, engines off, positioned for departures that would never happen. One had been partially taxied and then abandoned at an angle that blocked access to an entire strip. Ground vehicles were scattered in inefficient positions, some left mid-task, others idling without operators. It wasn't random. It was interruption. Whatever had started this hadn't given anyone time to finish what they were doing. I tracked the perimeter next. Security checkpoints were sealed, but unevenly. Some held. Others showed signs of pressure, not from outside, but from within. People were trying to force movement through systems that were designed to regulate flow, not contain panic. That mismatch was creating weak points. The longer I watched, the more the pattern clarified. The airport was no longer functioning as a coordinated structure. It had fractured into isolated zones, each reacting independently. Terminal sections operating on different timelines. Security acting without synchronized communication. Staff scattered. Some try to maintain order, others already abandoning roles entirely. And above all of it, the tower remained stable. That contrast was sharp enough to feel. Below, chaos was building in layers. Up here, everything still appeared controlled, but only because the system hadn't yet absorbed what was happening beneath it. That delay created an illusion of safety, one I recognized immediately. Control didn't exist here. It was just farther removed from the failure. I shifted my attention back to the systems inside the tower. Communication channels were still open, but cluttered with overlapping transmissions. No central authority had taken over. No clear directive was being enforced. That meant decisions were decentralized, and decentralized systems collapse faster under pressure. One of the controllers glanced at me, then back at his screen, choosing not to question my presence. That was another sign. Normally, access here would be challenged immediately. Now, priorities had shifted. If you weren't directly interfering, you were ignored. I stepped closer to an in-use console and brought up a broader overview of the airport grid. It took longer than it should have to load, another sign of system strain, but when it appeared, it confirmed what I'd already seen. There were no stable zones left, only areas that hadn't failed yet. That changed the equation. From the ground, survival meant reacting to whatever came next. From here, it meant anticipating it, seeing where pressure would build before it broke, identifying which systems would fail next, not waiting for them to. I looked back out over the airport, tracking movement again, but this time with intent. Not just observing, but selecting. Routes, access points, Elevated paths versus ground-level exposure, where visibility could be maintained, where would disappear completely. The chaos below hadn't slowed. If anything, it was accelerating. But from up here, it was no longer overwhelming. It was readable, and that made it usable. The control tower wasn't safety. It was advantage. Temporary, fragile, but real. And as long as I held it, I wasn't reacting like everyone else. I was planning ahead of them. First signs of system failure. The first failure didn't announce itself. It slipped in quietly, disguised as a delay. One of the radar feeds froze for just over a second before correcting itself. No one reacted. Glitches happen, especially under heavy load. But I watched the controller at that station adjust his headset, repeat a transmission, then wait longer than usual for a response. The delay wasn't just visual. It was systemic. I shifted to another console and monitored the communication channels more closely. Overlap had increased. Multiple voices transmitting at once, stepping over each other, forcing repetition. That wasn't just panic. That was loss of coordination. The system relied on structured communication. Without it, everything slowed down at the exact moment it needed to accelerate. Another screen flickered. This time it didn't recover immediately. A ground movement display went dark, then reloaded with partial data. Aircraft positions updated, but vehicle markers lagged behind. That meant anything moving on the ground was no longer being tracked in real time. That gap mattered. It created blind spots, and blind spots were where failure spread fastest. I stepped back from the console and looked across the tower. The controllers were still working, still issuing instructions, but their focus hadn't shifted. They were treating each problem as isolated instead of recognizing the pattern forming across all systems. That delay in recognition was more dangerous than the failures themselves. Below, the effect was already visible. Without accurate ground data, vehicles began moving inefficiently. A fuel truck attempted to reposition, then stopped abruptly when its path intersected with an untracked obstruction. Another vehicle idled too long in an active zone before someone manually redirected it. Small delays, but they compounded quickly. The system wasn't collapsing all at once. It was degrading piece by piece, each failure increasing the load on what remained. Then the announcement stopped. Not gradually, completely. The silence was immediate and noticeable. The constant background instructions that had been attempting to control the terminal simply cut out mid-cycle. No replacement. No fallback. That wasn't a choice. That was failure. I watched the terminal floor again. The effect was instant. Without centralized direction, movement became erratic. People stopped looking up for instructions and started looking at each other. That shift redirected attention from system to crowd, and crowds don't provide solutions. They amplify confusion. Security reacted next, but not uniformly. Some teams moved to reinforce already sealed exits. Others abandoned positions entirely to assist elsewhere. There was no coordinated response, just individual decisions being made in isolation. That fractured structure created gaps. I could see them forming in real time. Unattended checkpoints. Doors left unsecured. Corridors no longer monitored. The system wasn't just failing. It was losing its ability to prioritize. I turned back to the internal infrastructure. Power indicators showed the next problem before it fully developed. Load distribution was shifting unevenly. Certain sectors were drawing more energy than expected, while others dropped below operational thresholds. That imbalance suggested either damaged routing or overloaded circuits. Either way, it wouldn't stabilize on its own. A flicker passed through the tower lights. Brief, but enough to confirm instability. Backup systems should have compensated immediately, but the transition lagged. That meant either delayed activation or partial failure within the redundancy system itself. Redundancy only works if it activates faster than the primary system fails. Here, it wasn't keeping up. I traced the implications quickly. If power continued degrading, elevators would fail, completely automated doors would lock in current position, security systems would default, inconsistently visibility would drop in key areas. Each of those failures would compound the others. Then I looked at access control. Digital locks, depended on stable input. With communication systems lagging and power fluctuating, access permissions would start behaving unpredictably. Some doors would remain locked when they shouldn't. Others might open without restriction. That inconsistency would break any controlled movement strategy. I tested a secondary access panel in the tower. It responded, but slower than normal. Input delay. Confirmation delay. The system was still functioning but degrading. That window wouldn't last. Below, the consequences accelerated. A section of the terminal lost lighting completely. Movement there shifted instantly from chaotic to dangerous. People slowed, hesitated, collided. Visibility changes force behavioral changes, and those changes ripple outward. Adjacent areas adjusted in response, creating new pressure points where none had existed minutes before. I stepped back again and let the pattern settle. This wasn't a failure of one system. It was a cascade. Communication lag created coordination gaps. Coordination gaps created movement inefficiencies. Movement inefficiencies increased system load. Increased load destabilized power. Power instability disrupted access control. Access disruption intensified human unpredictability. And human unpredictability fed back into every other failure point. The system had entered a loop. It wasn't designed to break that loop. It was designed to operate under stable conditions, not adapt to escalating failure across multiple layers simultaneously. That limitation defined everything that would happen next. I stopped thinking about restoring control. That wasn't possible anymore. Instead, I focused on identifying which parts of the system would fail last. Not the strongest points, but the ones least dependent on everything else. Independent structures, manual access, line of sight advantages, areas where decisions could still be made without waiting on broken systems to respond. The tower still held for now, but I could see the direction clearly. This wasn't a temporary disruption. It was a system unwinding itself, one layer at a time, and anything still relying on it would collapse with it. I shifted my position, already recalculating, no longer watching for what might stabilize, but for what would break next, and how far ahead of that break I needed to be. Mapping the airport. I stopped watching the airport as a crowd and started treating it as a grid. From the tower, the layout resolved into something structured, even if the behavior inside it wasn't. Runways formed the outer boundaries, long stretches of controlled space that were now mostly empty, interrupted by aircraft positioned without purpose. Between them, service roads cut through like veins, connecting fuel depots, maintenance zones, and storage facilities. Closer in, the terminals spread outward in segments, each one feeding into central corridors that were now clogged with movement. I pulled up the internal layout system again, not to rely on it, but to cross-reference what I could still see. Some sections loaded. Others lagged or failed entirely. That didn't matter. I only needed enough data to anchor what I was already mapping visually. I divided the airport into functional zones. Runways, terminals, service areas, restricted access corridors, supply points, elevated positions. Each one had a purpose when the system worked. Now, they had different values. Runways were open, visible, and mostly clear of people. That made them useful for movement, but only under controlled conditions. Right now, they were exposed. Anyone crossing them would be visible from every angle, with no cover and no fallback. Terminals were the opposite. Dense, layered, filled with obstacles and multiple entry points. They offered concealment, but no control. Movement inside them was unpredictable, shaped more by panic than structure. That made them dangerous, but also necessary. Most supplies were still there. Service areas sat between the two, less crowded, more functional, designed for movement rather than gathering. Vehicles, equipment, fuel lines. These areas weren't built for people to stay in, which made them less attractive to crowds. That lowered immediate risk, but increased isolation. I marked them mentally as transition zones. I focused on choke points. Every system has them. Places where movement compresses, where multiple paths converge into one. Security checkpoints. Corridor intersections. Access doors between terminal sections. Under normal conditions, they regulate flow. Under stress, they become pressure points. I watched one near the east terminal. Movement slowed there first, then built, then stalled completely. People pushed forward without knowing why, creating density without direction. That density made movement harder, which increased pressure behind it. A loop building on itself. If something disrupted that point, power loss, a forced entry, anything, it would collapse outward, pushing people into adjacent zones in unpredictable ways. I shifted my attention to vertical movement. Escalators had stopped in one section, turning into static barriers instead of pathways. Elevators were already unreliable. That forced everyone onto stairwells, which were never designed to handle that volume under stress. Stairwells became vertical choke points, harder to monitor and easier to trap people inside. That mattered. Vertical control meant limited escape options. I traced possible routes from the tower down to the ground, not as direct paths, but as sequences. Stairwell access, corridor transitions, service exits. Each step depended on something else still functioning. Too many dependencies meant failure risk. I eliminated routes that relied on automated systems. What remained were fewer, less efficient, but more reliable paths. Then I mapped supply zones. Food vendors, storage rooms, maintenance closets, medical stations. Most were inside terminal areas, already compromised by crowd density. Some existed in restricted zones, harder to access, but less likely to be depleted immediately. I noted their positions relative to movement patterns. Supplies in high-density areas would disappear first. Supplies in low-access zones would last longer, but require risk to reach. That created a trade-off between immediate availability and long-term sustainability. I looked back at the tower itself. It sat elevated, isolated, with limited access points. That made it defensible, but only temporarily. Once identified as a stable location, it would draw attention. Not immediately, but eventually. Anything that looked controlled in a collapsing system becomes a target, either for protection or for pressure. Control attracts movement. Movement brings risk. That meant the tower wasn't a permanent solution. It was a vantage point, nothing more. I adjusted my map again, layering time into it. Which areas would fail first? Which would hold longer? Where pressure would build next? Where might release? Not predictions, just probabilities based on what I was already seeing. The airport wasn't random. It was reacting according to its design, even in failure. And that made it readable. I traced one potential route across the grid, starting from the tower, moving through a secondary stairwell into a low-traffic service corridor, then branching toward a supply zone near a maintenance area. It wasn't efficient, but it avoided major choke points and reduced exposure to unpredictable movement. It would work for now. I committed it to memory, then started building alternatives. Because any single path could fail without warning, and relying on one option was the same as having none. Below, the chaos hadn't slowed, but it no longer looked like chaos to me. It looked like a system under strain, following patterns it couldn't break. And as long as I could see those patterns, I wasn't trapped inside it. I was moving ahead of it. The first breach. The first breach didn't happen where the system expected it. I was watching the main terminal entrances, the reinforced points where security had concentrated resources, where barriers were thickest and visibility was highest. That was where pressure should have built first. Instead, the shift came from a side corridor most people had already ignored. At first, it looked like movement breaking pattern, a cluster forming where there shouldn't have been one. Not near an exit, not near a checkpoint, just a secondary access corridor that connected to a maintenance passage. People started backing away from it without clear direction, creating a widening gap that didn't match the flow anywhere else. I focused in. The corridor door was still closed, but it wasn't holding properly. The alignment was off by a fraction, enough to create intermittent movement as something pushed against it from the other side. Not constant pressure, not the kind of force I had seen building at choke points. This was irregular, testing rather than forcing. Then the door gave. Not fully, just enough to break the seal. Something slipped through the opening, not rushing, not collapsing into the space like the crowd behavior I had been tracking. It moved with purpose, adjusting to the environment instead of reacting to it. That difference stood out immediately. The first infected I had seen earlier moved unpredictably, driven by instinct, drawn to noise, following the simplest path toward movement. This was different. It paused just inside the corridor, not because it had nowhere to go, but as if it was orienting itself. Its head shifted slightly, scanning, not randomly, but in short, controlled movements. It wasn't looking for anything specific. It was processing. Behind it, more pressure built against the door. A second figure pushed through, then a third. They didn't collide with each other. They adjusted, creating space, forming a loose line that expanded into the terminal without breaking into chaos. That behavior didn't match what I had observed before. Below, the crowd reacted late. People closest to the corridor noticed first, pulling back, their movement triggering a delayed ripple outward. But by the time that ripple reached the larger mass, the infected had already moved beyond the entry point, spreading into open space where containment was impossible. Security responded, but not effectively. 2 personnel moved toward the breach, following protocol, attempting to intercept and redirect. They treated it like a standard intrusion, something that could be blocked, contained, reversed. They were wrong. The infected didn't charge them. They adjusted again. Movement shifted, splitting just enough to bypass direct confrontation, continuing forward into the terminal rather than engaging immediately. That decision, if it was a decision, changed everything. It meant they weren't simply reacting to obstacles. They were navigating around them. One of the security personnel hesitated, recalculating too late. The second stepped forward anyway, tried to hold position. The outcome was immediate and final. The line broke, not because it was overwhelmed, but because it was misread. Containment failed in seconds. From above, the effect spread faster than the breach itself. People didn't understand what they were seeing, only that something had changed. Movement lost whatever structure it had left. Direction became irrelevant. Individuals started moving without coordination, colliding, reversing, creating unpredictable currents that made the environment more dangerous than the threat itself. I tracked the infected instead of the crowd. They didn't follow the densest clusters. They moved along edges, along lines of movement, adjusting to where people were going rather than where they were. That behavior increased their reach without increasing their exposure. It was efficient. That was the moment the system broke completely. Barriers had been designed to slow movement, to regulate flow, to contain pressure. They assumed the threat would behave predictably, pushing against resistance until it broke or was redirected. But this wasn't pressure against a wall. It was movement through gaps. I shifted my focus back to the map I had built. Every zone I had identified as defensible depended on barriers holding long enough to matter. Every choke point assumed pressure would build in ways the system could anticipate. Those assumptions were no longer valid. The timeline collapsed with them. It wasn't a question of if the rest of the perimeter would fail. It was when and how unevenly it would happen. Some areas would hold longer than others, not because they were stronger, but because they hadn't been tested yet. That difference was critical. I recalculated immediately. Containment strategies were no longer useful. Holding a position based on existing barriers would only delay exposure, not prevent it. The focus had to shift from controlling space to controlling movement, from defending zones to navigating through them before they failed. Below, the breach widened, not in a straight line, but in branching paths that followed the structure of the terminal. Corridors that had once directed passengers now guided the spread. The design of the airport itself was being used against it. I stepped back from the glass. The tower still held its advantage, but it was already losing relevance. Observation without intervention only lasted as long as the system remained partially intact. Once failures reached a critical point, information alone wouldn't be enough. I looked down one more time, tracking the spread, noting the speed, the direction, the way movement adapted to resistance instead of collapsing into it. Barriers didn't matter anymore. Only timing did. And from what I was seeing, time was already running out faster than anything below could react to. Selective communication. The radio channels were still active, but they weren't useful the way they were meant to be. I cycled through frequencies slowly, not searching for a signal, but for patterns. Most channels were cluttered with overlapping transmissions, voices talking over each other, repeating fragments, asking questions no one was answering. That kind of noise wasn't information. It was confusion amplified through a system that no longer filtered anything. I muted the worst of it and narrowed the range. There were still structured channels in use, but fewer than before. Security frequencies had degraded into partial coordination, broken commands, and delayed responses. Ground operations were worse, reduced to disconnected updates that didn't align with what I was seeing from the tower. That mismatch confirmed what I already knew. Real-time coordination was gone. That left individual signals. Short bursts, isolated voices, people trying to reach someone specific and failing. Those were more valuable, not because they were clearer, but because they carried intent. Each transmission came from someone still trying to operate within a system that had already collapsed. I didn't respond immediately. Broadcasting without control would collapse the only advantage I had. The tower's position gave me visibility, but communication could erase that by drawing attention to a fixed point. Anyone listening, human or otherwise, could triangulate patterns if I wasn't careful. So I listened. One voice repeated every few minutes on a lower frequency. Calm, controlled, likely trained. He was giving location markers relative to known points, adjusting them as he moved. Not asking for help, not broadcasting panic, just updating position and waiting. Another signal came from a cluster inside the West Terminal. Multiple voices, no coordination, shifting rapidly between requests and arguments. They weren't moving as a unit. That made them unpredictable and high risk. A third signal appeared briefly, then disappeared. One word repeated twice before cutting out. That wasn't enough to act on. I prioritized based on stability. The calm voice came first. I waited for the next transmission, confirmed the pattern, then keyed in just long enough to respond. No introduction, no explanation, just a short acknowledgement and a request for confirmation. Keep it minimal. Keep it controlled. There was a pause before the reply came back. Longer than expected, but not uncertain. He adjusted his response immediately, tightening his location markers, aligning them with what I could verify visually. That told me two things. He was paying attention, and he understood the need for precision. That made him usable. I didn't give him my position. I didn't need to. Instead, I redirected him slightly, shifting his movement away from a developing pressure point I had already identified. Not a full reroute, just enough to avoid immediate risk. He acknowledged without questioning it. That was important. Trust, in this situation, wasn't built on reassurance. It was built on results. I ended the transmission before it extended too long. Next, I monitored the cluster in the West Terminal again. Their situation had degraded further. Movement was erratic, voices sharper, decisions overlapping. They were reacting, not planning. Any attempt to coordinate with them would require constant correction, constant exposure, and no guarantee of stability. I didn't respond. That decision wasn't about ignoring them. It was about preserving function. If I overloaded my own capacity, trying to stabilize something inherently unstable, I would lose the ability to act anywhere else. The radio shifted again. A new voice, quieter, closer to my map grid. She wasn't repeating herself, wasn't broadcasting continuously. Just one transmission, clear enough to stand out against the background noise. She gave a location, then stopped. I waited. No repetition came. That meant either she was conserving energy or she understood that constant broadcasting increased risk. Either way, it suggested control. I responded once. Same approach. Minimal. Direct. No identifiers. The reply came faster this time, but it carried hesitation. Not panic, but evaluation. She asked a question instead of confirming immediately. Not about safety, about accuracy. She wanted to know if the route I implied was still viable. I checked before answering. From the tower, I tracked the corridor she would need to cross. Movement there was unstable, but not yet compromised. Timing mattered more than direction. I adjusted my response accordingly, giving her a window instead of a path. She acknowledged, then went silent again. That was enough. I leaned back from the console and let the channels run without input. The system wasn't about connecting everyone. It couldn't be. Too many variables, too many unknowns, too much risk. Instead, it became a filter. Identify stability. Reinforce it. Ignore instability unless it directly affected the larger pattern. Each interaction carried weight. Too many transmissions, and I would expose the tower's position. Too few, and I would lose the ability to influence anything beyond observation. The balance had to be precise. Below, the breach continued to spread, reshaping movement patterns faster than most people could adapt. But through the radio, I could extend influence beyond line of sight, not by controlling the system, but by guiding individuals through it. Selective communication wasn't about helping everyone. It was about choosing who could still operate within the limits of what remained. And for now, that was enough to keep the system from collapsing completely around me. Securing the tower. The tower wasn't designed to be defended. It was designed to observe. That distinction mattered. Everything about it favored visibility over protection. Wide glass panels, limited internal barriers, a single controlled access point. It worked when the system outside it was stable. Now, it needed to be adapted into something it was never meant to be. I started with access. The stairwell door was the only direct route up, which made it both an advantage and a liability. If I controlled that point, I controlled entry. If I lost it, there was nowhere else to fall back to. I checked the locking mechanism again. Still responsive, but slower than before. That delay was a problem. I reinforced it manually. There wasn't much to work with, but the tower had maintenance equipment stored for emergency use. I dragged a metal utility cabinet across the floor and angled it against the door, not to block it completely, but to create resistance. Enough to slow forced entry. Enough to give me time. Then I looked at the glass. It offered a full view of the airport, but it also exposed me to anything that might reach this level. Direct access from outside was unlikely, but not impossible. I didn't try to cover it completely. That would remove the tower's only real advantage. Instead, I repositioned what I could: chairs, panels, anything that could break line of sight without blocking visibility entirely. Partial concealment, not protection. I moved through the rest of the space, taking inventory. Food was limited. A few stored supplies, nothing sustainable. Water was better, but still finite. Power was the most critical. As long as the tower remained connected to the main grid, systems would function. Once that failed, everything would degrade quickly. I checked the backup systems again. They were operational, but not designed for extended use at full capacity. Lighting, communication, minimal computing. Not everything at once. That meant I needed to control consumption before the system forced it on me. I shut down non-essential displays. Left only the feeds I was actively using. Reduced lighting to the minimum needed to maintain visibility without creating unnecessary draw. Small adjustments, but they extended time. Time was the only resource that mattered now. Once the immediate setup was complete, I established a routine. Observation cycles first. Every 15 minutes, I shifted focus across different zones. Terminals, runways, service areas, perimeter points. Not watching everything at once, but tracking changes over time. Patterns formed more clearly that way. Movement shifts, pressure points, new risks developing where there had been none before. Between cycles, I monitored the radio. Short windows. Controlled responses. No continuous transmission. Maintained presence without creating dependency. The individuals I had already contacted were adjusting. Their movements aligned with the patterns I was seeing, which meant the system I was building, small, selective, functional, was holding. For now. Then resource tracking. Food, water, power. I logged usage mentally, adjusting estimates as conditions changed. The numbers weren't good. They didn't need to be exact to show that. The tower could hold for a while, but not indefinitely. Every decision made here had to account for what happened when staying was no longer an option. That thought stayed in the background. The tower felt controlled. Quiet compared to everything below. Stable in a way the rest of the airport wasn't. But that stability was conditional. It depended on systems still functioning, on isolation remaining intact, on nothing breaching the single point I had secured. Too many dependencies. I returned to the glass and looked down again. From here, the airport still followed patterns, even as they shifted. The breach had expanded, but not uniformly. Some areas held longer than expected. Others collapsed faster. That uneven spread created temporary pockets of stability, but they were shrinking. And as they shrank, movement would redirect. Toward open space. Toward visibility. Toward the tower. I tracked a group below, moving more deliberately than the others. Not panicked, not rushing. Adjusting their path in response to pressure, avoiding dense clusters, staying near structural edges. They hadn't noticed the tower yet, but their behavior suggested they would eventually identify elevated positions as potential refuge. That was the problem with control. It drew attention. I stepped back from the glass and recalculated. The tower wasn't just a vantage point anymore. It was a signal, whether I intended it to be or not. Anything that appeared stable in a collapsing system became a point of convergence. Survivors would look for it. Threats would move toward it. Holding this position meant managing that risk, not avoiding it. I checked the stairwell door again. Still holding. Still quiet. For now, I returned to the console, adjusted the observation cycle, and reduced power draw slightly more. Small changes, extending function, delaying failure. The routine held the space together, gave it structure, made it feel controlled. But underneath that control, the variables were increasing. Isolation protected me. Isolation also limited me. And if the systems failed completely, if power dropped or access was compromised, the tower wouldn't be a stronghold. It would be a confined space with no secondary exit, elevated above a system that had already proven it couldn't be contained. I kept working anyway, because control, even temporary, was still better than reacting to collapse without it. But I stopped thinking of the tower as a solution. It was a phase. And like everything else in the airport, it had a limit I hadn't reached yet, but could already see forming. Resource reality. The tower felt stable until I stopped thinking in hours and started thinking in days. Up to that point, every decision had been immediate. Secure access. Reduce exposure. Maintain visibility. Short-term control. But control without duration is just delay, and delay only matters if it leads somewhere sustainable. So I stopped watching the airport for a moment and focused inward. I laid out everything the tower could provide. Food came first. There wasn't much. A few emergency rations, scattered snacks left behind by staff, nothing designed for extended isolation. Enough for a day, maybe two if stretched carefully. Less if stress increased consumption, which it always does. Hunger changes behavior before it becomes critical. That meant I had a narrow window before it started affecting decision-making. Water was better, but not by much. The tower had access to internal supply lines, but those lines depended on a larger system still functioning. If pressure dropped or contamination spread, that supply would become unreliable without warning. Stored water existed, but in limited quantities. Enough to delay failure, not prevent it. Power was the real constraint. Everything depended on it. Communication, visibility, access control, even the perception of safety. As long as the tower stayed powered, it maintained its advantage. Once that changed, the entire structure would degrade rapidly. I checked the load indicators again. Consumption had stabilized after I reduced non-essential systems, but stability didn't mean security. It meant temporary balance. The grid feeding the tower was already showing signs of uneven distribution. If one section failed, the system would attempt to compensate, increasing load elsewhere. That kind of shift could trigger a cascade. I ran the numbers in my head. Best case, the tower held full power for a few more hours without interruption. After that, instability increased exponentially. Backup systems could extend functionality, but only at reduced capacity. Limited lighting, limited communication, no redundancy beyond that. Time became measurable, not abstract, not uncertain, quantifiable. I estimated the maximum duration the tower could remain fully operational, then cut that estimate in half. Systems under stress never fail at their projected limit. They fail earlier under conditions you didn't account for. That adjustment changed everything. Up to now, the tower had been a position to hold. Now it became a resource to manage. Every action had a cost. Every transmission, every system check, every minute of lighting beyond minimum levels consumed something that wouldn't be replaced. Even observation cycles, the thing that gave me the most control, required energy. Not much individually, but enough over time to matter. I reduced the cycle frequency. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. That created a gap. Less observation meant less information. Less information meant slower reaction time. That trade-off was unavoidable. Conservation reduced awareness. Awareness consumed resources. There was no balance that eliminated both risks. I shifted focus again. Sustainability. Short-term survival is about avoiding immediate threats. Long-term survival is about managing decline. The tower wasn't a solution for either. It was a temporary advantage within a system that was already failing. I looked back at the grid I had mapped. Supply zones, movement corridors, choke points. From above, they had been options. Now they became requirements. If I stayed in the tower, I would eventually run out of resources. If I left too early, I would expose myself to a system still unstable. Timing wasn't just important. It was everything. I recalculated routes again, but this time with resource access as the priority. Which paths led to supplies that hadn't been reached yet? Which areas would remain viable longer based on current movement patterns? Which zones offered not just safety, but sustainability? Most of them failed under that condition. Terminal areas were already being stripped. Service zones had potential, but limited stock. Maintenance areas offered tools, not food. The only viable supply points were those that hadn't yet been identified by the crowd, which meant they were either difficult to access or temporarily ignored. Both came with risk. I returned to the radio briefly. The individuals I had contacted were still active. Their movement patterns confirmed my estimates. They were adjusting, but their range was limited by the same constraints I was facing. No one had access to a stable, renewable supply. Everyone was operating within diminishing resources. That reinforced the conclusion. There was no safe place in the airport. Only places that hadn't failed yet. The tower was one of them. For now, I shut down another non-essential system, reducing power draw slightly more. The change was minimal, but it extended the timeline by a fraction. Small gains mattered when everything else was shrinking. Then I stepped back and looked at the space again. It still felt controlled, still quiet, still elevated above everything else. But now I could see the limit clearly. The tower wasn't a stronghold. It was a countdown. And every decision I made from this point forward had to be measured against how much time it cost me and what it gave me in return. Because staying here wasn't survival. It was delay. And delay only works if you use it to prepare for what comes next. Movement below. The change didn't happen all at once. It tightened. From the tower, movement had always looked chaotic, but it followed loose patterns, clusters forming, dispersing, reforming. That gave me something to track, something to anticipate. Now those patterns were narrowing, becoming more defined, less random. I saw it first along the southern terminal. A line of infected moved through a corridor that had already been partially cleared by the initial surge. Instead of spreading outward into open space, they followed the structure itself, staying aligned with walls, adjusting direction at intersections without hesitation. Not fast, not aggressive, but consistent. That consistency was new. Before, movement reacted to noise or proximity. Now it looked like navigation. I tracked them longer. At each junction, they didn't hesitate the way survivors did. They didn't pause to evaluate. They shifted direction as if the layout was already understood. Not perfectly, not efficiently, but enough to reduce wasted movement. Enough to cover more ground without dispersing. That changed the equation. If movement became structured, then avoidance became harder. Predictable chaos can be managed. Directed movement can't be ignored. I shifted focus to the survivors. Their patterns hadn't improved. If anything, they were getting worse. Without announcements, without coordination, every group was operating independently. Some tried to hold positions near familiar areas, refusing to move even as pressure built around them. Others moved too quickly, abandoning relatively stable zones for unknown ones, driven by immediate fear rather than calculated risk. I watched a group near the West Concourse attempt to relocate. They started as a unit, moving toward what looked like a service corridor. Halfway there, someone broke formation, reacting to something I couldn't see from above. That break caused hesitation. Hesitation caused separation, and within seconds the group fractured into smaller segments moving in different directions. That fragmentation increased their exposure. Individually, they were faster, more agile. As a group, they had awareness and coverage. Losing that structure removed both advantages at once. I reached for the radio, then stopped. I could see the problem clearly. I could predict where it would lead. But intervening meant committing to a transmission, and every transmission carried risk. Not just exposure, but dependency. If I started directing movement for one group, I would need to maintain that control, adjust constantly, compensate for their mistakes. I didn't have the capacity for that. So I watched. That was the limitation of the tower. Visibility without reach. I could observe everything happening below, track patterns, anticipate failures, but I couldn't apply force. I couldn't enforce decisions. Influence was limited to what could be communicated, and communication itself was constrained. The infected didn't have that limitation. They didn't need coordination in the way survivors did. Their movement, structured or not, didn't rely on shared decisions. It relied on continuity. One adjusted, the others followed. No hesitation, no conflict. That made them efficient. Below, the group I had been tracking collapsed completely. Two individuals broke away successfully, moving into a less congested corridor. The rest hesitated too long, caught between directions, unable to commit to a path. The result was immediate. I looked away, not because I didn't want to see it, but because the outcome was already clear before it happened. Watching it didn't provide new information. Instead, I scanned the broader grid again. Movement across the airport was tightening in multiple zones. Survivors were compressing into smaller areas, either by choice or by pressure. Infected movement followed those compressions, not directly, but along the edges, closing gaps over time. It wasn't chase. It was containment. That realization shifted something. The system wasn't just collapsing. It was reorganizing under new conditions, and those conditions favored continuity over hesitation. The infected maintained continuity. Survivors didn't. I adjusted my observation cycle again, focusing less on individual events and more on directional trends. Where movement was heading, not just where it was. That gave me a clearer picture of what would happen next. And what would happen next wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. Zones would shrink. Paths would close. Options would narrow. The tower still gave me distance from that process, but distance didn't equal safety. It only delayed involvement. Eventually, the patterns below would reach a point where observation alone wouldn't matter. I checked the stairwell door again. Still secure. Still quiet. Then I looked back down. A small group had reached the base of a structure near the tower's perimeter. Not moving randomly, not scattering. They paused, looked upward, then repositioned along the edge, staying close to the building's shadow. They weren't reacting to the crowd. They were adjusting to the structure. That was enough to confirm it. The change wasn't isolated. It was spreading. I stepped back from the glass, not out of caution, but out of clarity. The tower hadn't lost its advantage yet, but the gap between seeing and acting was getting wider. And at some point, that gap would become the biggest risk in the entire system. Power instability. The first real drop in power didn't flicker. It stepped down. The tower lights dimmed in a controlled reduction, not a sudden failure, as if the system was trying to preserve itself by shedding load. For a moment, everything held in that lower state. Screens still active, radios still functional, visibility reduced but usable. Then the next layer failed. One of the secondary consoles shut down completely. No warning, no recovery cycle. Just a blank screen where live data had been seconds before. That kind of failure meant the system wasn't redistributing power anymore. It was losing it faster than it could compensate. I moved to the main panel, and pulled up the grid overview. It took longer to respond, then loaded partially. Segments of the airport had already dropped offline. Terminal lighting was inconsistent, some sections fully dark, others running at reduced capacity. External runway lights were flickering, switching between active and dead zones in irregular intervals. That inconsistency made movement below even more dangerous. People rely on light more than they realize. When it disappears, behavior changes instantly. Speed drops. Direction becomes uncertain. Decisions slow down, but pressure doesn't. That mismatch creates collisions, hesitation, exposure. I saw it happening in real time. A corridor that had been passable minutes ago went dark. Movement inside it stalled, then reversed, pushing people back into already crowded areas. That shift created a new pressure point where none had existed before. The system wasn't just failing. It was reshaping movement unpredictably. I returned to the panel and began shutting down everything I wasn't actively using. One screen, then another, reducing load manually, trying to stabilize what remained. The effect was immediate but limited. Power consumption dropped, but the grid didn't recover. That meant the failure wasn't local to the tower. It was upstream. Somewhere in the system, a primary distribution point had gone down. There was no fixing that from here. The tower lights dimmed again. This time, the delay between drops was shorter. I checked the backup system. Still operational, but not fully engaged. It was waiting for a complete failure before activating, which meant it wouldn't smooth the transition. It would replace it, and when it did, capacity would drop significantly. I forced the switch early. The system resisted for a moment, then transferred. The change was immediate. Lighting dropped to emergency levels. Screens reduced in brightness. Non-essential systems shut down automatically. The tower shifted from operational to survival mode. That transition removed more than comfort. It removed margin. With full power, I could monitor multiple zones simultaneously, track movement in detail, maintain communication without interruption. Now, every action had to be prioritized. Every system I used limited something else. I chose visibility first, reduced communication, reduced data feeds, kept only what I needed to track movement and anticipate changes. That decision narrowed my influence but preserved awareness. Without awareness, nothing else mattered. I moved back to the glass. The airport below had changed again. Dark zones expanded, breaking continuity between areas. Movement slowed where light was gone, then surged where it returned, creating uneven flow that was harder to predict. The infected adjusted faster than the survivors, maintaining direction even when visibility dropped. That gap widened their advantage. I looked at the tower interior. Emergency lighting cast long shadows, reducing depth perception, making the space feel smaller than it was. The glass panels reflected more now, creating blind spots if I stood too close. Even inside, visibility wasn't what it had been minutes ago. The tower was losing its edge. I checked the stairwell again. Still secure. But the lock response was slower now. Noticeably slower. That meant power to access control was degrading as well. If it failed completely, the door would default to its last state. Locked or unlocked. No guarantee which. That uncertainty mattered. If the door failed locked, I would be sealed inside. If it failed open, I would lose control of access entirely. Either way, the tower became a risk. I ran the timeline again. Backup power would last longer than the main grid, but at reduced capacity. Hours, not days. And that estimate assumed no further system damage, no additional load spikes, no unforeseen failures. Too many variables. I stepped away from the console and stood in the center of the room, recalculating without relying on the system. The tower had given me visibility. It had given me time, but it had also tied me to a failing infrastructure. Every advantage here depended on power. Without it, the tower became just another elevated position with limited exits and no sustainable resources. I looked back out over the airport one more time. The patterns were still there, but harder to read through the shifting light. Movement was becoming less predictable, not because it was random, but because visibility no longer supported observation at the same level. that reduced my ability to stay ahead. And staying ahead was the only reason the tower worked. I returned to the stairwell door and placed my hand against it, feeling the slight vibration of systems still running somewhere below. Still functioning. Still failing. The decision was forming. Stay and lose control gradually until the tower became a trap. Leave and trade control for movement while movement was still possible. Neither option was safe, but one of them still had time attached to it. I stepped back, already shifting my focus away from maintaining the tower and toward planning the descent, because whatever advantage remained here was shrinking faster than anything I could do to preserve it. Forced descent. I didn't wait for the system to fail completely. By the time it happens, options are already gone. The tower had reached its limit, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a steady reduction of everything that made it useful. Visibility was degraded. Communication was restricted. Power was unstable. Staying longer wouldn't give me more control. It would only reduce the options I still had. So I moved. The stairwell door took longer to unlock than before. That delay was enough to confirm the timing. Systems were still functional, but not reliable. I opened it just enough to listen before committing. Sound travels differently in enclosed spaces. Below, the noise was layered. Movement, distant impacts, something dragging across metal, intermittent bursts of sound that didn't match human behavior anymore. The pattern wasn't random, but it wasn't coordinated either. It was fragmented, shifting between silence and sudden activity. I stepped through and closed the door behind me. The lighting inside the stairwell had dropped to emergency levels. Dim, uneven, creating pockets of shadow between each landing. That changed depth perception, made distances harder to judge, but it also reduced visibility from below. That worked both ways. I started down slowly, not rushing, not stopping. Control movement. From above, the airport had been a system. From here, it became a series of confined spaces connected by limited options. Each level introduced new variables I couldn't fully see before reaching them. That was the first shift. Observation had been replaced by exposure. Halfway down, I paused. Not because I needed to, but because the sound changed. A movement below, closer than the rest. Not loud, not chaotic. Measured. Something moving within the stairwell itself, not outside it. I leaned slightly over the railing, keeping my position behind the structural wall. 2 levels below, something moved across the landing. Not fast, not searching, just moving. I didn't wait to identify it further. I reversed direction briefly, moving up 1 level instead of down, creating space without creating noise. Then I crossed to the adjacent access door and checked it. Locked. Still responsive. I opened it just enough to confirm the corridor beyond. Clear. I stepped through and closed it behind me, cutting off the stairwell entirely. That was the second shift. Routes that existed on the map didn't exist in real time. From above, that stairwell had been a direct path. In reality, it was compromised. If I had committed to it fully, I would have walked into a situation I couldn't control. I moved into the corridor. Lighting here was worse than in the tower, better than the stairwell, but inconsistent. Sections flickered. Others were completely dark. That forced a slower pace, but it also limited visibility from a distance. The air felt different. Still enclosed, but heavier. Not from lack of oxygen, but from what had already passed through the space. Movement leaves traces. Heat. Sound. Disruption. Even without seeing anything, the environment carried information. I followed the path I had mapped earlier, but I didn't rely on it. Every turn required confirmation. Every intersection needed a pause, not long enough to hesitate, but long enough to process. The advantage I had from above was still there, but it was delayed now, filtered through what I could actually see instead of what I had already predicted. That delay mattered. Ahead, a section of the corridor opened into a wider service area. I stopped before entering. From a tower, this had been a low-density zone. Minimal movement, high utility. Now it was different. A vehicle sat abandoned at an angle that blocked part of the space. Equipment had been moved or dropped, creating irregular obstacles. That changed line of sight created blind spots that hadn't existed before. And movement, not constant but present. I tracked it from the edge. Two figures, moving along the far wall, staying close to the structure the way I had seen earlier. Not rushing, not wandering, adjusting to the space instead of reacting to it. That confirmed it again. The patterns had followed me down. I adjusted my route immediately, shifting away from the open area and back into a narrower corridor that ran parallel to it. Less efficient, but more controlled. Fewer variables, fewer angles of exposure. Movement below had always been unpredictable. Now it was adaptive. That made every open space a risk. As I moved deeper into the airport, the difference between observation and participation became absolute. From the tower, I had been ahead of the system. Here, I was inside it, moving at its pace, reacting to its changes instead of predicting them fully. Control wasn't gone. It was reduced. Every decision had to be made with less information, less time, and higher consequence. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. I reached another intersection and paused again, listening, watching, recalculating. The tower was no longer part of the equation. This was. And from this point forward, survival wasn't about understanding the system from above. It was about moving through it without becoming part of its failure. Terminal breakdown. The terminal wasn't a system anymore. From the tower, it had looked unstable but readable, pressure building in predictable zones, movement following loose patterns. Down here, that structure was gone. What replaced it wasn't chaos in the usual sense. It was fragmentation. Small, disconnected pockets of activity colliding with each other without any shared direction. I entered through a service access point that opened into the rear of a concession area. The difference was immediate. Sound didn't carry the same way here. It echoed, bounced off hard surfaces, distorted direction. A single movement could sound like multiple sources. That made tracking harder, not because there was more activity, but because it was less clear. I stayed close to the wall and moved forward in short segments, stopping between each one. The first group I saw wasn't moving. 5 people, clustered behind an overturned counter. They had positioned themselves defensively, using whatever they could find to block direct access. From a distance, it looked stable, controlled. But the longer I watched, the more the flaws became obvious. They weren't communicating effectively. One person kept looking toward the open space ahead, scanning, while another focused entirely on a side corridor they couldn't fully see. The others shifted between both directions without committing to either. That split attention meant no direction was fully covered. Control without coordination. It wouldn't hold. I didn't approach, not because they were a threat, but because they were unstable. Any interaction would force them to react, and reaction in this environment meant unpredictability. I moved past their position without drawing attention, using the noise around me to mask my movement. Further in, the structure broke down completely. Resources had become visible, and visibility created conflict. A small storage area had been forced open, supplies scattered across the floor. 2 individuals argued over what remained, their focus locked on each other instead of the environment. Their voices rose, sharp and immediate, cutting through the surrounding noise. They didn't notice the movement behind them. I did. It approached along the edge of the space, staying just outside their line of sight. Not rushing, not reacting to the argument directly, but adjusting to the sound it created. The pattern was consistent with what I had seen before. I didn't intervene, not because I couldn't, but because the outcome was already determined. Any action I took would only shift the timing, not the result. And exposing myself in that moment would create a new problem without solving the existing one. I moved on. That was the reality of the terminal now. Every decision had to be measured against cost, not intention. Helping one situation could compromise everything else. There was no margin for correction. The deeper I moved, the less the environment resembled anything organized. Groups had fractured into individuals or pairs, each operating within their own limited awareness. Some tried to reform structure, calling out, attempting to coordinate, but without shared information, those attempts dissolved quickly. Movement patterns overlapped without aligning. One group would move through a corridor assuming it was clear, only to collide with another group moving in the opposite direction. That collision forced both to adjust suddenly, creating noise, hesitation, and exposure. The infected followed those disruptions. Not directly, not aggressively. They moved along the edges of those interactions, closing distance gradually, using the confusion created by human movement rather than generating their own. That made them harder to predict. They weren't driving the chaos. They were using it. I reached a central junction and stopped. From above, this had been a major choke point. Now it was something else entirely. No clear flow. No defined direction. People moved through it in short bursts, crossing paths without coordination, entering and exiting without pattern. The space didn't hold pressure anymore. It redistributed it constantly, making it impossible to predict where density would build next. That removed one of the last reliable indicators. Without choke points, movement lost structure. Without structure, anticipation became harder. I adjusted my approach again. Less reliance on mapped patterns, more on immediate observation. Shorter movement cycles, more frequent pauses. The strategy shifted from navigating the system to navigating the moment. That increased survival probability but reduced speed. Everything became slower. I moved along the edge of the junction, avoiding the center entirely. Edges still offered some predictability. Fewer directions of movement. Fewer variables to track. As I passed through, a voice cut through the noise. Not loud, not panicked. Controlled. I didn't turn toward it immediately. Turning creates exposure. Instead, I slowed slightly, adjusted my angle, and let the source come into view without forcing it. One individual stood near a partially blocked corridor, not calling out repeatedly, not moving erratically, just watching, waiting, selecting when to speak instead of reacting to everything around them. That stood out. Structure in a space that had lost it. I didn't approach yet. Not until I confirmed the surroundings, checked the movement patterns nearby, ensured that engaging wouldn't collapse the control they were maintaining. Because in this environment, stability was rare, and anything rare had to be evaluated before it was trusted. The terminal had lost its system. Now it was just pieces, and survival depended on recognizing which pieces still functioned, and which ones would break the moment you relied on them. Runway decision. The runway wasn't an option until everything else stopped working. Inside the terminal, movement had degraded into fragments, each decision reacting to the last mistake instead of anticipating the next one. Control wasn't something you could rebuild here. Not with limited resources, not with unpredictable movement, and not with the patterns shifting faster than any group could stabilize. That left one direction. Out. I moved through a maintenance corridor that connected the terminal to a restricted access gate leading toward the runway. From the tower, it had been a viable route. Low traffic, minimal visibility from the main terminal flow, direct access to open space. Now, it was a transition point between two different risks. Enclosed unpredictability behind me. Open exposure ahead. I paused at the access door and listened. The noise from the terminal faded slightly, replaced by something else. Wind moving across open space. Distant impacts, not as frequent, not as layered. The sound profile changed outside. Less chaotic, but not safer. I opened the door just enough to confirm. The runway stretched out in front of me, wide and mostly clear. Aircraft sat in irregular positions, some aligned, others abandoned mid-movement. Ground vehicles were scattered across the surface, creating partial cover in an environment that otherwise had none. It looked open. That didn't mean it was safe. From above, I had seen how exposure worked. Anything moving across the runway would be visible from multiple angles, with limited ability to change direction without losing speed. There were fewer obstacles, but that also meant fewer places to break line of sight. I stepped out and closed the door behind me. The shift was immediate. Space opened up, but control didn't increase with it. Without walls, without defined corridors, movement became less restricted but more exposed. Every step had to be deliberate, not because the environment forced it, but because it offered no protection if something went wrong. I moved along the edge first, staying close to the structure rather than crossing open ground. From here, I could see more clearly. One aircraft stood closer than the others, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been moved recently before everything stopped. Access stairs were still attached. The door was open. That made it different from the others. Viable. But viability came with conditions. Reaching it required crossing a section of open space with minimal cover. Once inside, it would provide temporary shelter, possibly access to supplies, maybe even a functional system if power remained. But it also created a fixed position. Easy to find, harder to leave. I stopped and ran the options again. Stay inside the airport. Attempt to rebuild control using what remained. Limited resources. Fragmented groups. Unstable environment. High unpredictability. Low sustainability. Or move to the aircraft. Gain temporary isolation. Potential access to contained resources. Increased exposure during approach. Reduced mobility once inside. Unknown system status. Neither option removed risk. They redistributed it. I shifted my focus back to the environment. Movement along the runway wasn't empty. At a distance, near another aircraft, I saw motion. Not fast, not clustered. Individual figures moving along the structure, staying close to the body of the plane, adjusting to its shape the way I'd seen inside the terminal. That confirmed the pattern had extended outside. Open space didn't eliminate the threat. It changed how it moved. I adjusted my route. Direct movement toward the aircraft would be the fastest, but also the most visible. Instead, I angled slightly, using scattered vehicles as intermittent cover. Not full protection, but enough to break line of sight between each movement segment. Timing became critical. Move too slow, and exposure increases. Move too fast, and mistakes happen. I advanced in controlled bursts, stopping behind each piece of cover long enough to reassess, then moving again before hesitation set in. Halfway across, I paused, not because I needed to, but because the environment shifted. A sound carried across the runway, distant but clear enough to change movement patterns. Not from me, from somewhere else. That sound redirected attention, creating a temporary gap in the area I was crossing. I used it. Moved through the next segment without stopping, closing the distance faster than planned. The aircraft grew larger in my field of view, details resolving. Open door. Stairs intact. No visible movement near the entry point. That didn't mean it was clear. It meant nothing had revealed itself yet. I reached the base of the stairs and stopped again. This was the decision point. Inside, I could establish a control position, even if temporary. Outside, I retained mobility but lost any form of stability. Both options required commitment. Neither allowed reversal without cost. I looked back once toward the terminal. From here, it no longer looked like a place that could be controlled. Just a structure breaking itself down from the inside. Then I looked up at the aircraft. Contained. Defined. Limited. A different kind of risk. I placed my hand on the railing and started up. Because waiting longer wouldn't create a better option. It would only remove the ones I still had. What still works? The aircraft door closed with more resistance than expected. Not from damage, but from disuse. Systems that sit idle don't fail immediately. They resist first. That resistance told me something important. This space hadn't been compromised yet. Not fully. I didn't assume safety. I moved through the entry slowly, clearing the immediate area before committing further. The interior was dim, lit by partial emergency systems that hadn't fully shut down. That meant power still existed here, separate from the main grid or sustained long enough to outlast it. Limited but functional. I stepped into the aisle and paused. The environment was contained, defined. No open corridors, no shifting crowd patterns, no external variables moving unpredictably across the space. That changed the equation immediately. Movement here could be controlled, not because the system was intact, but because the space itself imposed limits. Limits create structure. I checked the cabin first. Empty, not abandoned in panic, but left mid-process. Seats unoccupied, overhead compartments partially open, items still in place. That suggested evacuation had been interrupted, not completed. That mattered. It meant the aircraft hadn't been stripped of resources yet. I moved forward. The cockpit door was closed but unlocked. Inside, systems were partially active. Not enough to operate the aircraft, but enough to confirm that auxiliary power had held longer than the main infrastructure outside. Displays flickered at low intensity. Some inputs responded, others didn't. That inconsistency matched everything else I had seen. Not failure, but degradation. Still usable. I didn't try to restore full function. That wasn't the goal. Instead, I identified what still worked. Lighting, limited but stable. Internal communication systems, partially responsive. Environmental controls, reduced but active. Each one extended the time I could remain here without relying on external systems. Time again. Always time. I moved back into the cabin and began a controlled sweep. Food supplies were limited, but more than the tower had offered. Packaged, contained, untouched. Not sustainable long-term, but enough to extend the window. Water reserves were intact. Storage compartments held additional emergency equipment, some useful, some irrelevant. I didn't take everything. I cataloged it. Resources aren't valuable because they exist. They're valuable because they're managed. Taking everything at once reduces flexibility. Leaving options in place preserves it. I returned to the front of the aircraft and looked out through the cockpit window. The runway stretched ahead, still open, still exposed, but different from this perspective. From inside, the environment outside became something to observe again, not something I was immediately inside of. That shift mattered. Not full control, but distance. Enough to think. Movement continued across the runway, but it was slower here. Less dense. The patterns I had tracked inside the terminal still applied, but with fewer variables. That made them easier to read again. And reading the system was the only advantage that had remained consistent. I checked the door behind me. Still sealed. Still holding. This position wasn't permanent. It couldn't be. The aircraft was a contained system with limited resources and no long-term sustainability. But it wasn't failing in the same way the airport was. It had fewer dependencies, fewer points of failure. That made it stable for now. I sat for a moment, not to rest, but to reassess. The airport hadn't collapsed completely. It had fragmented. Systems failed, but not all at once. Some parts still functioned. Some areas still held structure. The problem wasn't total failure. It was uneven failure. And uneven systems can still be used. That changed the way I looked at everything. Survival wasn't about finding a place that worked perfectly. That didn't exist anymore. It was about identifying what still worked, even partially, and using it before it failed. The tower had worked until it didn't. The terminal had worked in fragments, then broke apart. This aircraft worked now. Eventually it wouldn't. The pattern was consistent. I looked out at the runway again, then back at the systems inside the cockpit. Not everything was gone. Not everything was broken. The system hadn't ended. It had changed. That meant the approach had to change with it. Not escape. Not containment. Adaptation. Use what functions. Move before it fails. Repeat. I stood, already adjusting my plan beyond this space. Not waiting for stability, but preparing for the next shift because whatever came next wouldn't be a solution. Just another phase. And as long as something still worked, even partially, that was enough to stay ahead of complete collapse.